Welcome everybody live in the DPC offices in Glasgow. It's not sunny, but it's not raining. It's just gone 12 o'clock on World Digital Preservation Day, the 7th of November, 2019. So welcome to everybody tuning in from around the world live, but also as we are recording, a warm welcome also to everybody who tunes in later. The theme of World Digital Preservation Day is at-risk digital materials. So it's appropriate today to introduce the newest edition of the global list of digitally endangered species, also known as the BitList. And I'm joined by William Kilbride, Director of the DPC, to help us launch the list and learn more about it. So we'll chat to introduce the list. And then after we do that, we will open the floor to questions if anybody has anything. So firstly, William, can you tell us what is the BitList?
Sure thing, happy to do so, Sarah. So first of all, hello everyone from me. The BitList, as at its core, is a list of digital objects and digital materials and a summary of the risks and challenges faced with looking after that material for the long term. It lists materials which the digital preservation community around the world has told us are at risk. So these are the people whose job it is to ensure long-term access to digital materials in whatever shape or form they find them. And it's their job to ensure that we can access those for now and for future generations. That group has experience built up over 2-3 decades in some cases in trying to make those digital materials available. And through the BitList, that community of experts, that community of practitioners is telling the world really, about what keeps them awake at night, about what they struggle to preserve. So it doesn't seek to classify the whole of the digital universe. It's those things which that expert community knows are hard to preserve. It's not some theoretical top-down exercise. It's based on real practical knowledge, and that's maybe different from digital preservation 20 years ago. And it's not a marketing stunt. So I should explain, the DPC is technology neutral, it's vendor neutral. We're not selling some tool at the end of this. We're just trying to give you the unvarnished truth, the unvarnished experience of the digital preservation community. It comes from real people in real contexts working hard to ensure that our generation has something meaningful to pass on to the future.
So who is this list for, William? Who's the audience of this list?
Sure, so the list has really 3 audiences, and to understand it, first and foremost, the BitList is an advocacy tool. It comes from the DPC's advocacy subcommittee, in fact, and we nod to them briefly at the start of the call today because it was their original initiative and idea. It's an advocacy tool, and so as an advocacy tool, it's really aimed at senior managers, policy makers who invest or develop the plans to invest around digital infrastructure. And also it's aimed at those technology vendors, top solution providers who design and implement digital infrastructures for us. So that's the key kind of main audience of the BitList. But there are 2 other audiences that matter here too. So firstly, read in a different way, the BitList becomes a roadmap for research and development because it's telling us what the problems are. And smart, clever researchers or product developers in the digital preservation community can then use that to say, well, hey, here's something that needs research. Here's something that I could sell a tool into solving. And then thirdly, it acts as a kind of description of the state of the art as it currently is in November 2019. And because it's a description of the state of the art, it can be very, very useful for example, digital students who are approaching digital preservation for the first time, because it'll describe what it's like actually in the workplace. And also it's going to be helpful there for teachers who are teaching those students. And indeed, it's going to be helpful for established practitioners who are approaching maybe a new content type or a new problem in digital preservation for the very first time. So those are the key audiences, but understand first and foremost the advocacy purpose of the list.
So how many entries are on the list in 2019, and what are they like? What types of things?
So there are 74 entries on the list, 74. So that's a big increase on previous years. So the entries, to explain how this works, the entries define quite broad categories of materials. So let me pick some examples. You know, there's, for example, there is an entry for digital content within museums. It's a very broad description, and that includes all sorts of different types of materials, of course. Now, why do we find it so broadly? Well, we define it very broadly in order that the categories can be quickly understood. And there is, I guess, a tension between being kind of quick and digestible in terms of advocacy, you want to achieve that, but also being detailed and very specific, which is where you would act on recommendations. So the BitList tends towards to be generalised, and it tends towards quite broad groups to be digestible. But here's how it works. So imagine you're looking at one particular digital object that's in your collection. Maybe you're responsible for a blog that some researcher did at your institution a few years ago. Well, you'll find on the BitList definitions of material which are like that. So you'll find things around social media, or you'll find things around published or unpublished research, or grey literature. And blog posts might fall into the grey literature category. And what you need to think about, so there's a definition of grey literature, and there's a definition of the risks associated with that and how to respond. What you have to think as to whether or not the classification given to that applies to the particular instance that you have, particular item in front of you. So also to say out loud, it implied also there earlier, entries overlap. So you might have a digital object which falls into more than one of these described categories. And because it falls into more than one category, that tells us something about the risks. That tells us something that, you know, this material has different shapes of risk, different types of risk, and it's going to be potentially more complicated or more tricky to try and resolve some of those risks. So those overlapping classifications mean that an object may have a greater risk than initially suggested. The good news is that in every case, we've got a little condensed action plan, a little timeline as to how you might want to go about addressing those risks, and also a little description of what good practice would look like when faced with some of those materials.
Excellent. So how is the list broken up? How is it organised?
Yes, so the list is organised in the highest level. It's broken into 5 categories. And every item on the list is assigned one of these categories. So at the simplest level, the most encouraging level, we have lower risk materials. And lower risk materials describe those things where, you know, there is a preservation need for some obvious preservation requirement, but for a variety of reasons, we're fairly confident that those requirements are being met by a service, by documentation, by whatever means necessary. Moving up through the categories, the next group up is vulnerable. So vulnerable materials are where there's an obvious preservation need, but there's a question mark as to whether or not that preservation need is being met. And I'm going to return to that vulnerable category later because I think it's quite important to consider in the context of the digital world more generally. But continuing up through the list, we have our kind of 2, I guess, main classifications of endangered and critically endangered, and they sit side by side. So something's endangered where there's a significant technical challenge or where there's no obvious authority capable of delivering preservation against that challenge. Critically endangered is where there's an obvious technical challenge and there's no authority capable of looking after the material. Then at the top end of the bit list are materials which we describe as practically extinct. And by the way, we don't think these materials aren't always extinct. We just think that there's some reason to suppose that if you've got those materials, you need to act really quickly. Materials which are going to be inaccessible to most practical endeavours. And if you have them, immediate action is probably going to be your best approach to resolving those issues.
So how many entries are in each category this year?
Yeah, so in lower risk, we are telling the world that there are no entries in the lower risk category. But for reasons that will become apparent, it's possible for things to enter or leave that group on a particular instance. We've got 11 items listed as vulnerable. we have 29 endangered, 28 critically endangered, and 6 items which we consider to be practically extinct.
So who decides, so what thing, or can things move up and down the list? Can they move between categories and classifications?
Yes, they can. That's a good question, good observation. So, and you don't even need to wait till next year for something to move up or down the list. Let me explain how this works. So, as I said, we don't think there's anything that was brought to us as lower risk. And I suppose if you think about it, who would bring something to the table that they thought was lower risk when our job is to identify kind of at-risk materials? Well, we've said there's nothing lower risk, but we do know what good practice looks like. So something, if it's on the list, say as vulnerable or endangered, we can identify what good practice is for that class of material. So for any one item that you may have, you can identify that good practice, you can document that good practice is in place, and that gives reasonable comfort that something, although broadly speaking defined as endangered or vulnerable, actually in the practice and in this particular case might be lower risk. So we know what good practice looks like. Also, we know what aggravating conditions exist and how to handle those. So again, if you have something which looks fairly robust in its own terms, something that you're reasonably confident could be preserved or shouldn't be any trouble to preserve, and yet there are all sorts of aggravating conditions which inhibit that, in that sense, something can move quite quickly up the list. So you might start with something that looks vulnerable, but actually, once you've done some assessment of it, you end up recognising that it's critically endangered, even or practically extinct. So even if a file is robust in itself, there may be some active threat or some active action of negligence. I don't know if you can have active negligence, but some active negligence, which means we need to be more concerned.
So who decides what makes onto the list and where it's classified, how endangered it is?
Yes, okay, so how do we do that? We have quite a long process to make the bit list, to make sure it isn't gamed, as it were, by, say, technology vendors or people wanting to draw attention to a particular collection that's of interest to them. Fundamentally, things come onto the list for 2 reasons. They come on either through an open submission process. So we had an online submission process in July and August this year. We invited the DPC, we invited the digital preservation community globally to participate in that and to identify the materials that they thought were at risk. So we get that open submission. Also, we've got the previous bit list. So we add the open submission to the previous bit list, and that creates a kind of master, quite substantial, quite long list of materials. And then we have to start a process of sifting through this very substantial list. So the first check is an eligibility check by the DPC. Is this credible? Is this just spam that's come in? Or is this something that we can't make any sense of? So a few things get knocked off on that basis. Also, duplicates are identified at that stage. So there are things which are identified 2 or 3 times over, and you think, actually, we're hearing the same thing 2 or 3 times. That tells us something, but it doesn't mean we need 2 or 3 different entries. That then goes to the first SIFT jury, which is effectively the DPC's advocacy subcommittee with 1 or 2 additions. So they do a first SIFT and make sure that what they think is on the list is also credible. And critically, they then identify where we think we need additional expert support, and they help us identify those other experts that are going to come on board also to help us make sense of the list. We bring in a whole bunch of new experts. Those additional experts then do a detailed review, and we get all the results back of their detailed review. There's a lot of spreadsheets, and we compile those spreadsheets together into one. And at the end of that, we have a master scorecard, which goes back out to the expert jury, which meets in one big long panel session, which was in the middle of October. So we sat down with the whole of the expert panel, all of the jury, all of the experts, and said, how do you think we're doing with this? And that gives an opportunity to work through, especially to work through the, what would you call it, the borderline cases where we're not sure something's up or down, or whether there's some question marks still over whether an entry is credible. After that process, we produce a full draft report, and that full draft report's gone out to the jury for a week or so of commentary and review. It's helped us identify a few examples. For example, Matt Barr, who was on the jury, he identified some particular games materials which we needed better examples of. He was able to help us with that. That peer review process then ends with the final report, the sign-off, which was what was completed, really only just completed, I guess, on Monday of this week. The key to this is the jury. It's the jury that's the key. There are about 30 people on the jury. It depends how you count them. It's a large panel of experts. They act collectively, so we are bound by our kind of corporate decision making. They know their stuff in detail, but also it's very diverse to represent the breadth of the community internationally as well as subject specialists. So we work quite hard to make sure that the jury knows their stuff and is able to act freely and without any conflicts of interest to make sure that we have a balanced picture of the digital preservation challenges that the world faces.
So thinking about this new edition of the list, just out now, fresh off the press, as you said, only just sort of signed off, what are the main themes that you take from it? What's gone up, what's come down?
Yes, so considering the length of the report, I mean, the first thing you'll notice is it's almost 100 pages. It's much more substantial than it was the first time we published it. So why? On that basis, let me say that a few highlights are worth reporting. So there'll be an opportunity perhaps later for people to come in with specific questions. And we've now released the report, and the link is on Twitter. Maybe I could ask Sarah or Alison or someone to put the link into the chat box. If you've not seen the full report, this is your chance to just quickly take a look at it. For my part, I would give you 5 highlights, 5 aspects that are apparent to 2019 that weren't perhaps apparent in previous years. It's personal reflection really rather than a comment from the jury, but I think you deserve a bit of guidance or a bit of a talk through. So I'm going to talk about eye-catching new entries. I'm going to talk about the overall trends. I'm going to talk about good practice and showing what can be achieved. I'm going to talk about the greater depth and the greater insight of the report. And I'm going to then reflect a wee bit around this question of vulnerability. So first of all, some eye-catching new entries. The BitList reminds me a bit of the dictionary. So you know how every year there's a kind of news report about new words that have made it into the dictionary? I discovered, by the way, the other week that floppy disk made its way into the dictionary in 1972 when I was born. So I am the same age as the floppy disk, at least in terms of its dictionary definition. And that process always reveals something of the concerns and the mores of the time in which they're entered. We have some eye-catching new entries on the list. So the ones that catch my eye, non-standard public records. Non-standard public records where you know there's just a WhatsApp group somewhere and government officials, maybe elected officials, maybe senior civil servants or policy advisors are using, for example, a WhatsApp group to share information which maybe they don't want in the public, maybe should be defined under the Public Records Act, or maybe just with the best intentions in the world, an archival agency could never know it exists and never put it on a file plan and therefore never have it transferred to the archives. And here we sit in the UK, here we sit in Glasgow in Scotland today in the middle of a general election, and you just know that records, digital records are being created which are going to be important for transparency purposes and yet are not captured for the public for the future. Another new entry on the list, open source intelligence. Open source intelligence is an interesting example, and we'll come to that in a bit more detail in a minute. But open source intelligence allows journalists, investigative journalists, I'm thinking of Bellingcat as a great example, but there are others who use open source intelligence to identify misinformation or propaganda, and they're able, in some cases, even to pursue criminal prosecution based on open source materials published through social media, published through online, through web forums and so forth. Now that open source intelligence has many characteristics. Some of it's quite gruesome, and not surprisingly, the open social media companies are under quite a lot of pressure to close that material down quite quickly, or it's misinformation, or it's propaganda. So not surprisingly, the social media companies are keen to may be seen quite right to be seen to suppress or remove that material from public circulation. Also, the perpetrators, this could be the evidence of them committing a crime, and consequently it's in their interest to obscure, to delete, to obfuscate that evidence. However, all of those processes of deletion create a preservation challenge, and it takes a different shape and a different nature depending on the time and the nature of the challenge. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Open source intelligence, however, really eye-catching new example. And finally, in terms of new materials, I've already mentioned, for example, data in museums. Let me explicit, data is not museum collections, but it's data in museums. So there's a sense that we get in the jury that museums are a little behind the curve in terms of their digital preservation capabilities in relation to, for example, archives and libraries. Why is that? Well, archives and libraries have digital as the core of the collection, whereas museums, oftentimes the digitals are sort of some sort of prop to the collection. They exist to support collection management, but they're not the collection itself, so perhaps not quite invested in the same way. So there are quite a few eye-catching new entries, and I look forward to people digging into and finding those new entries. I promised a word about trends, so let me talk about the trends, the list. So we've done this now 3 years. This is officially version 2 of the list. We did it in 2017. We did an interim report in 2018. This is version 2 officially, and you can begin to see from 2017 to now what are the major changes. And this is a strange one for me to answer, because I can't really discern any real trends towards improvement, nor can I determine any particular trends to greater concern. Now that might sound interesting. Again, you get the report, it looks huge, right? That doesn't mean there's a lot more to worry about. But let me observe that the digital preservation community has to work really hard to stand still. The amounts of digital material expands, the complexity of that material expands, the importance of that material to our lives expands. And in that context, there's no discernible trend towards the reduction of risk. That probably actually is a cause for concern. It means we're working very, very hard, but we're only managing to stand still. There are, however, some good practice examples to talk about. And let me pick out one that strikes me. It's going to sound a bit strange. I'm going to talk about web archiving here. And that's your own particular field, Sarah. Web archiving, what's going on here? So there's references to web archiving throughout. So social media, there's various things on platforms, various things on different types of cloud services. But the most obvious entry for web archiving is around domains without legal deposit legislation. So there's a great concern on the BitList this year expressed for domains where there is no obvious legal deposit regulation allowing an agency to take a preservation copy. So national libraries, British Library, National Library of Scotland, others work towards the collection of digital materials, and they're able to keep preservation copy. Sometimes the rules are unenforceable, sometimes the rules are a bit odd, sometimes the rules simply don't exist, sometimes they are tremendously permissible. So the entry in the BitList is about domains where there is no legal deposit legislation. That might seem a strange thing for me to represent as good practice, but what that tells me is that the preservation community is ready. It's ready to do the preservation work that it needs to do, that it thinks it needs to do. What's stopping us isn't the technology. What's needed is new regulation and new thinking around those procedures and processes. We could do this if only we could get on with it. That seems to me to be a good news story. Let me move on to the greater depth and the greater insight into the report. We have tried to break things up in order that we can provide some fundamental, more useful, more targeted advice around digital materials. And that's actually down to the hard work in particular of the jury. And hopefully the report will therefore provide, I think there's always a balance between being really specific and therefore authoritative, but also being sort of generalised and therefore in a position to be more influential. And hopefully we've found that balance. Finally, I said I wanted to ponder for a moment this question of vulnerability. So there's nothing lower risk. Well, there is, because if you work your way through the logic, there are some things where we know there's good practice, so although they may appear vulnerable or critically endangered or whatever, we know we can draw them back down to lower risk in any particular instance. But it occurs to me that the digital world is born vulnerable, that those vulnerabilities only expand through time if actions aren't taken. And in this digital world, which is vulnerable by default, digital preservation becomes a concern for everyone, because everyone's social, personal, political, economic, commercial lives depend, a greater or lesser extent, on digital interactions. Those are my highlights of a very quick summary of a very substantial document, and I look forward to expanding on that more in the future.
Well, thank you very much, William, for talking us through the BitList and giving your digest of it. So I will now then open the floor to questions. If anybody has any questions about the BitList or the process of putting the BitList together or how to use the BitList, feel free to just put your hand up, turn your mic on, and ask away.
We've also got the chat box as well.
We've also got the chat box.
If that's easier. So we might be looking over the chat box. That's not, we're not being rude, looking away.
Just remember that you might be muted. So if you're trying to ask a question and no one's responding, to check your mic.
Shall I, while people are thinking the question, maybe I could give you my top 6 practically extinct entries.
Go for it, William.
So I haven't gone through these in detail, but let me observe legacy interfaces and services by online companies, major online companies. So this is your Facebook interface or your Google interface. Now those, what we've learned I think over the years is that we can preserve the data, but actually the interfaces, the algorithms that generate those interfaces are open to all sorts of manipulation. Again, this speaks to the times we live in. And there's very little understanding, I think, in the digital preservation community of those algorithms and how those interfaces work. So we preserve the content, but unless we're also having a better idea of how those algorithms are working and also how they're changing minute by minute, and how, for example, machine learning is having an impact on how they're generated, then we need to work harder on that. So legacy interfaces, that's a new entry onto the list, but it goes straight in at number 1, so to speak, straight in as practically extinct. I've already mentioned non-standard public records, that's a practically extinct category. And older open source intelligence. So I mentioned open source intelligence. Actually, it's not the current investigations, but it's the historic ones that are most at risk, because those materials weren't captured, and because they weren't captured, they're not necessarily available. We have our 2 entries held over from last year about bulletin board services, but also teletext services. In the bulletin board services, there's just no news to report. We haven't managed to track down any really good examples of how that's improved. However, we do have good stories to tell, I think, emerging around the preservation of teletext, and it depends on some experimentation which colleagues are undertaking fairly soon to see if they can move from a small-scale example to a large-scale implementation, and that actually might come down the list.
Yeah.
And finally, unpublished research data. So research data, very broadly defined in previous lists. However, what we've now got is a very particular set of materials around unpublished research data, which has got a very specific entry at the top of the list. And if I can use a throwaway phrase, it seems to me that, you know, research implies some sort of openness, some sort of FAIR principles, they call them now, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, around data. Not all science is reproducible. So I'm an archaeologist, and I know that not everything can be reproduced. But fundamentally, if you're not sharing your data, then that's not good practice in terms of research. And maybe we should say, if you're not sharing your research data, you're not able to share your research data, you might as well be in the magic circle, because it doesn't look like good research. Anyway, I think we've got some questions coming in. Do you want to host some of these, or shall I read them out? Shall I?
Scroll up to...
Yeah.
So Barbara from the National Records of Scotland.
Yeah.
The non-standard public records status, spot on. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you to the jury. Are there any preservation examples from anywhere in the world? Are there any good practice examples for that one, William?
I don't know of any published good practice examples, but I do know, if people are listening, I recall that there's some work done recently at the International Criminal Tribunal. I might have misremembered that, so that's just putting me on the spot, where they've been specifically looking at how to preserve WhatsApp groups, specifically around WhatsApp groups. Obviously, if there's an obvious export mechanism, if there's an obvious export path, then that situation can be improved. But maybe other people on the line are better placed to answer that question about where there might be good practice around non-standard public records. Next question, or shall I read this one out?
It's a bit far from me.
From Elizabeth, yeah, to the screen over here in a small scale. Do we have examples of people using this as an advocacy tool? Elizabeth Thurlow says she mentioned the BitList in a conference this year, and it caught people's attention, a useful source of information. But also digitally endangered being a great band name. Yeah, I think we should. We'll record something for next year. Yeah, Elizabeth, you can be the manager or lead singer or whatever role you choose. Other examples, yes, we try. I don't think we have them all, but we certainly try to track those examples. So I mentioned the teletext material. I know for a fact the BitList drew attention to this in such a specific way in 2017 that this moved right up the agenda of one of the agencies responsible for the preservation of that type of broadcast material. And it's only now, because they've now been able to do that preliminary research, that they're looking for a major funding application which could actually save that material. That's a home run in terms of where the BitList would want to be. There are other examples off the top of my head. I can't remember. So community archives. We had community generated content on the BitList last time. We've now split that in two, by the way. So there's community archives, which is the archives of small community groups, maybe political groups. Also, there's kind of community generated content in arts and heritage. So this is where you get a big art project or a big heritage project. First World War commemoration stuff, for example. So we're able to take that reference directly to, and we have taken that reference directly to, for example, funders in that space. And I know of currently 3 grant applications which are using the BitList to draw attention to the community archive.
Grant applications are a great example of how it can be used.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a few examples, Elizabeth. But always we're looking for more, so please do let us know. So Rachel asked, I missed some of this, but can you talk through some possible practical approaches, especially with those entries which are identified as possible to mitigate with community work? How would we address that? So we've tried to provide in every case a good practice. Okay, it's a very, by the way, it's completely telegraphed, completely summary, but we've tried to provide a model of good practice. Has the thing been replicated? Are there different types of storage? Are the files properly documented? So if you want to talk about community engagement, I mean, I think that's where you're going with this, some sort of crowdsourcing, Rachel. If you want to look at crowdsourcing, I would encourage some sort of crowdsourcing, particularly around metadata and documentation. By the way, that's not always possible. And it introduces another problem, because then you need to get that crowdsourced metadata into the preservation repository, which might create a problem of synchronization. But I think that's an obvious place where you can do that. We've tried to provide good practice examples. It might well be that what you want to do is to just set up a stall. Set up a stall somewhere and get people to bring out your deads, bring your digital materials along, and we can provide some sort of surgery. And that's certainly been something that I know that 1 or 2 people are doing for World Digital Preservation Day. I'd love to know better examples. Maybe we could share some experience with people on that in the future.
Oh no, fire alarm.
What's happened?
Paul says, apologies, I've already answered this. They had a fire alarm, so missed it. I hope that it was just an alarm and not actually fire.
Yeah, Paul, is that Paul Stokes or Paul Wheatley? I'm not sure which, but it's got more and more detail since its launch. Is it becoming much more than an advocacy tool? Oh, there you are. Well, that's a good question, Paul. I mean, there are a couple of tensions here. One of the tensions is, you need to be authoritative, and if you're going to be authoritative, you need to deep dive. So how do you maintain authority with that depth of knowledge and yet have a kind of really big impact at a kind of bullet point level for senior managers? And I think the first time we did it, we did a very good job of the bullet points, but we didn't have the depth of wisdom. I think this tends towards more the depth of wisdom, but it's a fair question as to whether we've got that balance right. And I don't know. So there's that tension. There's the tension of the credibility and the really detailed knowledge, which adds authority, versus the impact you can have with a few bullet points. Third tension, which I'll be open with, is that the DPC isn't resourced to do the bit list in the detail that it could be done. This could go really deep. I mean, one of the recommendations from a jury member, which we then put to wider discussion, for example, there's things in here about storage devices. So there's a whole set about current and non-current storage options. And the recommendation was that the six, I think there are 6 entries, maybe there's more, 6 or 7 entries around storage. That should be broken up into the 100 or 120 different storage categories. Right? Wow. Storage isn't digital preservation. And we don't want to get into that sort of place where it becomes a kind of top trumps of storage or top trumps of file formats, because that could be every possible file format could have its entry in the bit list. That would be far, far, far too much. But I do want to make sure we are detailed enough to be credible. Where will it go in the future? Well, come back in 2020, we'll do another version of it, and it's a provisional statement. I haven't made that clearly enough. This is a provisional statement. We look, and at the end of this call, at the end of this half hour or hour, we're going to be saying to the world, what have we missed? Bring it to us, add to the list, help us develop it further, because it will be an ongoing commitment.
So how can people add things to the list?
Sure. So the first point of call are the contact details which are on the list. So just alert us to things, and you can do that in 2 or 3 different ways. So first of all, just contact us and we'll discuss it, and we're quite happy to take that on board and then raise that with the subcommittee. So there's a subcommittee that owns this, and ultimately we can put it to that subcommittee if we need an addition or an amendment to the list. And that's a process that can happen. What you could do, and we've got a category which we've called of concern. So there's nothing in that category, by the way. There's nothing in that category because we've been right through the list, and there's nothing in this catch-all category. But the of concern category exists where we say somebody's come to us, we don't yet know what it is really, we haven't had time to assess it, we just know that there's a concern, so we could add things under the of concern button in the interim.
Yeah.
This time next year there'll be a new edition. Get involved. It won't be an open submission process. It will be a review process, so it'll just be a kind of desk-based review rather than an open call. 2021, there'll be another open call for submission. So that's the medium term.
So what should people do if there's something on the list they feel their institution should be responsible for, and they're looking for some guidance and some support? What's the course of action there?
So first of all, let's read the list, okay? Let's identify the particular items that you have. So we've got broad categories, you've got particular items. Let's just triangulate your objects against the different groups on the list, the good practice, the aggravating conditions. Let's put those together and see where you actively come out. Number 2, what you then need to do is to use that in advocacy. So the bit list sits alongside 2 or 3 other DPC resources, the Executive Guide for Digital Preservation, the Rapid Assessment Model, also the Business Case Toolkit. So those tools exist as if you like, a production line that in theory could take you from practically extinct or very high risk content into an operative service which is actually dealing with the issues case by case. But it's going to require advocacy at senior management level. Sometimes it's not the technology that stops us far too often, it's the investment, it's the policy, those issues that arise. So that would be my recommendation. And by the way, if the DPC can support you in that advocacy work, we're here. We have an active programme of generalised advocacy, but also quite content to turn up in people's institutions, to speak to staff, to speak to senior managers. If that's what would help you, then you know where to find us.
In Glasgow, in the basement.
In the basement, in the DPC bunker in Glasgow, where the sun is shining, truth be told.
So do we have any final questions, or just anything anyone's thinking about, or a really good World Digital Preservation Day event you've got coming up that you just want to talk about a bit?
I'm going to take silence as happiness around the world.
Contentedness.
Yeah.
Or a lot to think about.
I would love to know from you, and you could do this now or you could do it later, I would love to know from you what it is that you would do, what you will do, what you would like to do with the BitList, and where you think it would be most impactful and deployed. You know, the BitList is this effort to try and make the weather, you know. It's going to lead the news tomorrow night. Well, of course it won't, but we have to hope that it will. It will try, you know, it will get people's attention in a different way. And if we can make the weather, we can make the news, then by the time you come to approach your senior managers, maybe they'll have heard of some of this stuff already, and maybe they'll have be more supportive and have a better year for you. Good. Can I say quite a few thanks before we end up today?
Yeah, on you go.
I want to thank, obviously, I want to thank the jury, the 30 or so people who really gave us quite a lot of time to work through all the entries in the list. And in particular on the jury, I invite you to call out any individual person, but let me particularly call vote thanks to Jane Winters. Jane chairs the advocacy subcommittee and was the chair of the jury. The chair of the jury has a different role from what you might expect. They don't run the agenda, but their job is to make sure that good practice, you know, just procedurally, that any conflicts of interest are dealt with, and that it's an honest, you know, account that takes, you know, is aware of the DPC's values. So many thanks to Jane. Let me also, in particular, pause for a moment of appreciation, a round of applause for Sarah Middleton, because Sarah's been working hard on this since probably the BitList was done last year. So thank you very much to Sarah, who has been working pretty tirelessly on all aspects of the list. So
and of World Digital Preservation Day.
And World Digital
and all of the blog posts.
And everything else that we do. So,
and a beautiful cake. I don't know if that's been revealed yet.
Yeah, well, I haven't seen official evidence of that, only through back channels. So hopefully there'll be a slice for us as well.
All right.
Good.
Well, I think that's all from us at DPC headquarters in Glasgow.
Yes.
So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And of course, if you have any follow-up questions or comments, don't be a stranger. Get in touch.
Thank you all very much. Bye for now.